How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Sunday. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Sunday? Sharon in New Jersey, Yehuda in South Carolina, Lucy in Minnesota, Shandora in the Bronx, Melissa in Great Neck, Paul in Chicago, Paula watching in the house, Paula in Florida, Carla in Brazil, Ryan in Jacksonville, Florida. A co-worker of mine asked me why did I cut my nails not in order, and I told her that us Jews cut our nails in a specific order, and her mind was blown. Joe, shalom from the Inland Empire. Also, Aoife in Florida, Ella, Marjorie, and Penelope in Anaheim, California. And Marjorie, so glad you're here. Tonight's sponsor of this show is Marjorie Holler, our very own Marjorie Holler. And this is a beautiful dedication, and I wish I had done it myself. So thank you, Marjorie. Dedicating tonight's show in memory of the third yahrzeit of Rabbi Adin Evan Israel, meaning Rabbi Steinsaltz, whose yahrzeit was actually the 17th of Av, which was on Friday. So it's just a kind of a hectic, crazy week. But so just a couple of days late, we dedicate our learning today to Rav Steinsaltz. What a... I think it was Time Magazine or Newsweek Magazine called him a once-in-a-millennium scholar. And that's because he was the first person since Rashi to do an entire commentary on the entire Talmud, in addition to a commentary on a Mishna, on the commentary on the entire Bible. And we are using the Koren Talmud, the Koren Talmud Bavli. In this class, it's what I teach you every night. That's this. And, as you can see, commentary by Rabbi Adin Evan Israel, Rabbi Steinsaltz. So when we say an elucidation, it means it's not just translating the Hebrew and the Aramaic that comprise Talmud Bavli, but also there's a lot of language between the words. If I only read to you a strict translation, it would probably be a 15 or 20 minute class every night, but we wouldn't know what, we would miss so much, right? So what I'm reading to you is Rabbi Steinsaltz's elucidation, meaning it's as if Rav Steinsaltz was teaching it to us. That's what the Koren translation and elucidation is. So you always want to learn something in somebody's honor on their yahrzeit. It's a little bit more merit for them and lifts them even a little bit higher in the world of souls. But our learning in this class, and it's one of the largest daily Gemara shiurs in the world, our learning accrues to Rabbi Steinsaltz's merit every day for 7.5 years. So really, we're so blessed. We're so grateful that he created this wonderful translation and elucidation. It makes it so much more possible for us to learn together. My first journey through the Talmud Bavli, I used the Art Scroll translation and elucidation, and it's wonderful. It's fantastic. I am in no way, I would never say anything, not the least bit negative. The Art Scroll translation and elucidation was a magnificent achievement. Then it was done a little bit before the Koren. But I think for our class, Rav Steinsaltz's elucidation works just a little bit better. And one of the things that I love about it is he's very much in keeping with our mission here at Accidental Talmudist to make it accessible to everybody without dumbing it down. And that's exactly how he approached things. And also I like that in the Koren, and thanks to Rav Steinsaltz, that whenever a question of halacha comes up, there's a note in the margin. It tells you where the halacha, where the actual Jewish law ended up. And that's, I think, a nice feature for our class. But at any rate, Marjorie, thank you for making this dedication and enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. Marjorie, may you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings. And we say Amen. Our daf today is page 78 here in Tractate Gittin, the 19th volume of the Talmud. These are the laws of divorce. We're working our way through chapter 8 today, continuing our discussion of Mishnah number 1. This chapter addresses what it means to literally give the get, right? So a couple is divorced when the husband gives the wife the bill of divorce, the get. So what constitutes giving? Obviously, if he places it in her hand and says, "This is your get," simple case, they are divorced. He has to do that in front of witnesses, of course, but that's the simple case. So what if she says she doesn't want to take it? No, I don't take it. I'm not going to take it from your hand. I refuse to take it. So is the divorce going to be stopped because she won't open her hand and receive the get? No. He can, literally place it on her lap. He can put it right near her under certain conditions. If she owns her own courtyard or her own house, or if he gives her a courtyard or a house in order for her to receive the get, these are all valid means of her of placing the get in her domain, which will trigger the divorce. So we pick this up a few lines from the bottom of page 77b. The Gemara relates that there was a certain man who threw a bill of divorce to his wife. And again, we talked about this a little bit yesterday, this language of throwing. Who would throw a divorce document to their soon-to-be ex-spouse? It seems so callous and unclassy. But really, I think the word throw here is a legal term, and it's to distinguish from handing it. Right? So if he were to hand it to her, then it would be the simple case. He's throwing it, meaning he's not placing it in her hand. So it's just traveling from her without a handoff, right? I think that's the importance of the verb throw here. So the Gemara relates that there was a certain man who threw a get to his wife while she was standing in a courtyard, and as opposed to his courtyard or her courtyard. She was standing in a courtyard. So the get went and fell onto a board of wood. Rav Yosef said, we see the precise circumstance. If this board of wood encompassed an area of 4 cubits by 4 cubits, so it thereby is considered to be a separate domain of its own and not included in the courtyard within which she was standing. So if we say that this was her courtyard, or that the husband is giving her the courtyard so she can receive the get, or he's lending her the courtyard so that she can receive the get, but she's standing in a courtyard. So even if we say that this courtyard is her courtyard and she's in it, and therefore she can receive the get by it just being placed in her courtyard, but if it's placed not in her courtyard, but rather on this alternative domain, this platform, this piece of wood that's a platform of some sort, that we can somehow say is separate from the courtyard, okay, so since this platform has its own status as a separate domain, and it is not her domain, and it's separate from her courtyard, which is, for now at least, her domain. So, okay, the get didn't land in her domain. That's what they're saying, and therefore the divorce did not take effect. So if the board encompassed 4 cubits by 4 cubits, it is a separate domain on its own. It is not included in the courtyard within which she was standing. And so consequently, she is not divorced. And if the board was not that large, then it is part of the courtyard in which she's standing, and it is all one domain, and placing the get in that domain affects the divorce. Now the Gemara clarifies, with what are we dealing here? If we say that the incident occurred in her courtyard, so if the board had an area of 4 cubits, 4 by 4, so what of it? Since the board belongs to her as well, it should still be an effective divorce. Rather say that the incident occurred in his courtyard. But then, even if the board did not have an area of 4 cubits, what of it? Since none of it belongs to her, why would it create an effective divorce? And the Gemara answers, no, it is necessary to state this in a case where he lent her the place, meaning he lent her the courtyard as a means to acquire the get. And since people lend one place but do not lend 2 places, if the board is considered to be a separate domain, then it was not included in the courtyard that was lent to her, and it would therefore not be an effective divorce. And you can kind of see how this would work. If he says, I'm lending you this courtyard that you're standing in, it's now your courtyard. You have effective control over it, and here's your get. She doesn't want to take it in her hand, but he places it on the floor in that courtyard that he lent to her. Okay, then they're divorced. It's in her domain. It's hers right now. But let's say that in this courtyard, there was a big tree in the middle, and there was a treehouse up in the tree, right? And you could see like a magnificent modern exotic travels type of treehouse with a bed and a room and a bell to ring for service, etc. So it really is like another apartment, right? And it's not it's in a tree that comes out of that courtyard, but you can see that's a separate domain. And when he says I lend you this courtyard, it's not the same as saying I lend you the courtyard and the treehouse. And so if you place the get in the treehouse, so it's not the same as placing it in the courtyard, and that's why they're not divorced. And, when we just talk about a board of wood, we might just imagine a board lying on the ground. But if you imagine it as the platform in a treehouse, it starts to make more sense to us. Now, the Gemara notes, and we said that this is the law only in a case where the place onto which the get fell was not 10 handbreadths higher than the courtyard. But if the place onto which the bill of divorce fell was 10 handbreadths higher, even though the board did not have an area 4 by 4 cubits, it is still considered to be a separate domain, right? So my treehouse example, even if it's a very small platform, but it's well above, 10 handbreadths is like waist high, basically, about 40 inches. If it's higher than that, it's a separate domain, and you can't say that you gave her the get by putting it in her domain if you actually put it on a platform that is separate from the domain that she's standing in. And we said this is the law only in a case where the place onto which the get fell does not have a modifier, meaning that this board is not referred to by a unique name. But if it has a modifier, let's say this little platform in the tree, we called it the eagle's nest. Okay, so now it has its own specific name. So even though it's small, it's definitely considered a separate domain. And that would be the truth, apparently, even if it's smaller than 4 by 4 cubits, and maybe even if it's less than 10 handbreadths above the ground, because it is its own specific domain. Then even though so even if it didn't have that area, it would be a separate domain, and divorce would not be effective. We are on 78a now. It was taught in the Mishna, in Mishnah number 1 of this chapter, that if the husband throws the get to his wife while she's standing in his house, then she is not divorced, even if the get is with her in the bed, i.e., he throws it onto the bed in which she is sitting or lying. So Rava says they taught this only in a case where he throws the get to her and it is with her in his bed. But if he throws the get to her and it is with her in her bed, then she is divorced. And this is also taught in a Baraisa. Rabbi Eliezer says if he throws the get to her when she is in his bed, she is not divorced. If he throws it to her when she is in her bed, she is divorced. And the Gemara asks, if he throws the get to her in her bed, is she divorced? But the bed is like vessels of a buyer that are in the domain of the seller, since the bed that belongs to her is in the house of the husband. Now, when they talk about vessels of the buyer in the domain of the seller, this is very interesting. Your vessel can acquire something for you. Now remember that when there's a purchase and sale or a gift that is transferred, for the gift to be finalized, or for the purchase and sale to be finalized, the one who is acquiring needs to make a formal act of acquisition. We call that a kinyan in Hebrew, right? So if he's buying an animal, he has to actually take the animal and pull it closer to him. If it's a piece of real property, he's going to have to do something with that real property. And here we're talking about somebody who goes to the market and he buys, some goods. So even though the money changed hands, he hasn't formally acquired the item. Now, if he says, here's $1 for 4 avocados, right, and he picks up the avocados, boom, that's the king and it's done. The purchase and sale is complete. But let's say he never touches the avocados, but he brought his own bag to the market. So once those avocados enter his bag, it's like his bag acquired the avocados for him. Now, there's definitely some nuance and exceptions to this rule, as we're going to discuss. But even as we're discussing, let me just read to you where the law ended up on this. Regarding a person's vessels. A person's vessels can serve to acquire items on his behalf if the vessels are placed in a location where he has the right to place them. Therefore, once an item enters a person's vessel, the transaction cannot be retracted. Now, a person's vessels cannot serve to acquire items for him if they are in the public domain or in the domain of the seller. Well, wait a minute. I thought the marketplace would work. Now there's an issue. That's the public domain, or if we're in a store, then we're in the domain of the seller. Unless the seller said that the vessel should serve to acquire the item for him, or he gave permission to the buyer to place the vessel there, right? So when a supermarket invites you to bring your own bags in, right? So now you have permission to bring your vessel into the supermarket, right? And when you place your items in the bag, not for the purpose of carrying them to the register, but after you've paid and you put the items in your bag, now you've completed the sale and it's valid in every way, even if they put the items in your bag for you rather than you actually lifting the items. So with that in mind, how are we talking about a person bringing a bag to a marketplace or a basket to the marketplace? How is this comparable to a wife acquiring a get in her husband's house because he places it on her bed? Because her bed is like her vessel. Let's read on. Because the bed is like vessels of a buyer that are in the domain of the seller, since the bed that belongs to her is in her husband's house. Now, can you conclude from here that even if the vessels of a buyer are in the domain of the seller, that the buyer acquires anything that is deposited into his vessels? This issue is disputed elsewhere. Some hold that when a vessel of the buyer is in the domain of the seller, the vessel cannot serve to acquire an item on behalf of the buyer. And that's why the halakha came out with that nuance that your vessel can acquire items for you even in the domain of the seller, so long as the seller gave you permission to put your vessel there, or the seller himself or herself placed the items in the vessel, indicating that they were completing the acquisition by placing it in your vessel, as if he was placing it in your hand. And the Gemara answers, no, it is necessary to state this law in a case where the bed is 10 handbreadths high, as then the bed is considered to be its own domain. So the Gemara challenges this. But there is the place where the legs of the bed are standing. The legs are standing in the husband's domain. But the Gemara answers, people are not particular about the place of the legs of the bed since it is so small. Therefore, since the bed is considered to be its own domain, it is not considered to be within the domain of the husband. And let's review again what our Mishna said. It was a very short Mishna, right? The one that we're discussing now, Mishna number 1 in chapter 8. It said, in the case of one who throws a get to his wife, and she is in her house or her courtyard, then she is divorced. If he threw it to her in his house or his courtyard, even if the get is with her in the bed, she is not divorced. She is not divorced. But if he threw the get into her lap or into her basket, then she is divorced, right? So that bed is a little bit problematic. It's not really like her vessel for these various reasons, whereas her lap or her basket would be like her own vessel. Now, it was taught in the Mishnah that if the husband threw the get into her lap or into her basket, then she is divorced, even if she is in her husband's house at the time. And the Gemara asks, why is she divorced? Is this not like the case of the vessels of a buyer that are in the domain of the seller, with regard to which there is a dispute concerning whether the vessels can serve to acquire an item on the buyer's behalf or not? And Rabbi Yehuda says that Shmuel says the Mishnah is referring to a case where her basket was hanging from her body, and therefore it is not considered to be within the domain of her husband. And so Rabbi Lazar says that Rabbi Oshaya says the Mishnah is referring to a case where her basket was hanging from her body. And Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, Reish Lakish, says, if the basket was tied to her, then that is enough, even if it is not hanging from her body. But if the basket is literally tied to her, then even if it's resting on the ground, but connected to her by some kind of cord, well, then it's clearly her domain, and the husband can place the get into the basket if she won't take it from his hand into her hand. Now, Rav Ada bar Ahava says the Mishna is referring to a case where her basket was placed between her thighs and is therefore in the place where she is sitting. And since her husband is not particular about the place in which she is sitting, it's considered her domain. And Rav Misharshia bar Rav Dimi says the Mishna is referring to a case where her husband was a basket seller. And therefore, he is not particular about the place where the basket is, since his whole courtyard is full of baskets, and is therefore considered to be her domain. It's her basket, no matter where she rests it. And Rabbi Yochanan says there is no need for these explanations, since the place of her lap belongs to her, and the place of her basket belongs to her. And Rava said, what is the reasoning of Rabbi Yochanan's statement? Because a person is not particular, not about the place of his wife's lap, nor about the place of her basket. It is as though he transferred ownership of that place to her for her use. And this is also taught in a baraisa. If he threw the get to her into her lap or into her basket or into anything that is like her basket, then that's her domain and she is divorced. And the Gemara analyzes the wording of the baraisa. What is included by the expansive term, anything that is like her basket? It serves to include the basket from which she eats dates, as she is not particular about its place as well, right? As opposed to like her backpack. That's her, day-to-day basket for carrying stuff around. Even if it's just a basket that she uses now and then to take a snack from, but it can be assigned to her. It's like clearly her basket, even if she doesn't use it very often. Boom, he can put the get in that, and it's going to affect the divorce. Now remember, all of this assumes that it's a properly written, properly executed, and properly witnessed get when he gives it to her. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 1 here in chapter 8. Here comes Mishnah number 2. If he said to his wife, take this promissory note, but it was really a get, or she found the get behind him and he did not tell her what it was, but she reads what is written in it and discovers that it is her get. But this is, in those cases, it is not a valid get until he says to her, this is your get. If he gave it to her in her hand while she was sleeping, and he then woke her, and when she reads what is written in it, she finds that it is her get, it is not a valid get until he says to her, this is your get. Okay, so now I think we all appreciate this mission. Right? We've been, it's a very patriarchal system. Only the husband gives the wife a get, but now the sages are going to protect the wife. He can't trick her. She doesn't want to take the get. So he doesn't tell her it's a get. He says, oh, here's a promissory note because I owe you a bunch of money. And she's like, oh, really? And she takes the paper. It's like, ha ha. She reads it, oh my God, I'm divorced. She's not divorced because he has to, in a forthright manner, hand her the get, and she won't take it. He can place it in her domain. But as he does so, he has to say, this is your get. Or his agent has to say, this is your get. And you are hereby permitted to marry other men because you are divorced, right? But this is your get. He has to say that. He can't trick her into accepting a piece of paper, and she might not even read it or look at it carefully, and only weeks, months, or years later discover that she's divorced, right? Lest that happen, he has to tell her he's giving her the get. That is Mishnah number 2. Here's the Gemara. Apropos the Mishnah's statement that if she found the get behind him, it is not a valid get until he says, this is your get. The Gemara asks, and when he says to her, this is your get, what of it? Why is it considered to be a valid get if it was not given to her in the proper manner? Being that it is as though he told her, take your get from where it is placed on the ground. But if she won't receive it, he can place it in her domain. But what he cannot do is, like, let's say they're standing in the street in a public place, He puts the get on the ground and he says, hey, pick it up. That's your get. And then she picks it up. No, he didn't give her the get. He can't just tell her to pick it up where he placed it. He has to give it to her. So the Gemara is asking, what does the Mishnah mean where she finds it behind him? That's the same as picking it up. He never handed it to her. And if there's no actual act of giving, then there's no divorce. So how could this work? What is the Mishnah talking about? And Rava says that if one says to his wife, take your get from where it is placed on the ground, it is as though he has said nothing. And it is not a valid get, since a woman is divorced only when the get is given to her by her husband. So the Gemara answers, say that the get was not placed on the ground behind him, but rather she pulled it out from behind him. In other words, the get was tucked into his belt and she pulled it out. Consequently, she received the get from him. And the Gemara immediately challenges this. If she pulled it out of his belt, it is also not a valid divorce, since it required the directive from Deuteronomy 24:1. The husband gives it in her hand. And we just said that in her hand, her domain is like her hand. Her courtyard is like her hand. But he still has to give it to her. She pulling it out of his belt, there's no act of giving. So how can this be a divorce? And the Gemara answers, it is necessary to say this in a case where he bent his waist over toward her and she pulled it out. And by extending his waist toward her is as though he gave her the bill of divorce to her. I mean, this is like, right, a couple walks out of a supermarket, he's got 6 bags of groceries in his hand, and he says, reach into my pocket and get the car keys. Right there, he's giving her the car keys because, he's kind of extending his hip to her. It's clear why he's not handing her, even though she's the one going to reach into the pocket and get the car keys. He's really giving her the car keys. He's just not able to use his hands at that moment. But it is a valid act of giving. So this would be a weird way to hand over a get. But you never know. I mean, perhaps the guy broke his arms. He's got 2 arms in a sling. And he, literally walks over with the get in his belt that a witness placed there for him. And he says, this is your get. I'm giving it to you. Please take it from my belt. That would be a valid act of giving. And we could see why that would happen. And this is also taught in a baraisa. If the husband said to his wife, take this promissory note. Right? It's a get, but he's calling it a promissory note. He's mislabeling it. He says, take this promissory note. Or if she pulled it out from behind him and read it and saw that it was her get, this is not a valid get until he says to her, this is your get. Okay, at least once he tells her this is your get that you've just acquired, you can see why that might work. This is the statement of Rebbe. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, actually, it is not a valid get until he takes it back from her and gives it to her again. Right? Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar wants to be much more cautious and careful and make sure that there was a valid act of giving. So if, she picked it up or took it from his waist or he told her was something that it wasn't. So he says there was no valid act of giving. Even he tells her that he's just given her the get. No, he's got to take it back and actually say, this is your get, as he hands it to her. Now the Brisa continues, if the husband gave it to her in her hand, but she was sleeping, and he then woke her, and when she reads what is written in it, she finds that it is her get, this is not a valid get until he says to her, this is your get. He has to say it. This is the statement of Rebbe. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, no, even then it's not a valid get. He has to take it back from her hand and hand it to her while she's awake and tell her, this is your get, and only then are they effectively divorced. And the Gemara notes, and it is necessary to mention this dispute in both cases, right? Both the case where he told her was a promissory note, or she pulled it out from behind him, or the case where he put it in her hand but she was asleep. In both cases, Rebbe says it's enough that once she realizes what she's got, that he says, this is your get. And Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, no, he has to take it back, and then as he puts it in her hand, say, this is your get. So the Gemara is asking, why do we need both cases? Don't they teach the same lesson? And the Gemara notes, it is necessary to mention this dispute in both cases, as if this dispute would have been stated only with regard to the cases in the first clause, one could assume that Rebbe is saying his opinion specifically with regard to the cases in this clause, because she is subject to being divorced, since she is awake and able to receive a get, even though he did not tell her that this is a get. But if he gave it to her in her hand while she was sleeping, she is not subject to being divorced, since while she is sleeping, she is a person who lacks the halakhic competence required to receive a get. Therefore, one could say that Rebbe concedes to Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar that giving the get while she was sleeping is not totally valid, or rather is totally not valid, and it was therefore necessary to mention that Rebbe disagrees in this case as well. And if this dispute had been stated only with regard to this case where he put it in her sleeping hand, in her hand while she was sleeping, one could assume that specifically with regard to this case, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar is saying that he must give her the get a second time. But in the other case in which she was awake, one could say that he would concede to Rebbe that it doesn't have to be given a second time. Therefore, it is necessary to mention the dispute in both cases. And Rava says, if the husband wrote a get for her and he placed it in the hand of her slave, when the slave is sleeping and she is guarding the slave, then it is a valid get. Within the context of the laws of divorce, a slave, as slavery was practiced in the ancient world, has the same status as land in the sense that both belong to their owner. Therefore, when the husband places the get in the slave's hand, it is as though he placed it into her courtyard. And we said her courtyard is like her hand. So if her slave was awake, however, it is not a valid get, even though the slave is owned by her, because a slave that is awake, has his own will, right? Can make up his own mind. Even though he's owned by the woman, he's not like her courtyard. If her slave was awake, it is not a valid get because he is like a courtyard that is not consciously secured by her. Since he guards himself, he therefore does not acquire the get on her behalf. Now, if she appointed her slave to be her agent, that would be something else. But just handing it to her slave doesn't work. Now, Rava continues, if the slave is sleeping and she is guarding him, it is a valid get. And the Gemara asks, but why? Isn't it true that the slave is like a mobile courtyard, and a mobile courtyard does not acquire items on behalf of its owner? And if you would say that a case in which he is sleeping is different because he is currently not moving, but didn't Rava say in any case in which if he would be moving, he would not acquire items, then even if he is standing or sitting, he also does not acquire items. And the Gemara concludes, and this halacha that Rava said, indicating that it is a valid get, applies only where the slave is literally bound and sleeping, since only in that case, placing the bill of divorce in his hand is like placing it in her hand. Obviously, a very unusual and probably hypothetical circumstance that the sages include here to test our understanding of the law and what is the underlying principle. And with that, we conclude our discussion of Mishnah number 2 here in chapter 8. Here's Mishnah number 3. If the woman was standing in the public domain and her husband took the get and threw it to her, if it fell closer to her... Oh, wait a minute. I'm sorry. I apologize. I should have said, we're done. That's where we're going to leave off. I didn't give you a warning, but I'll be reloading the comments and questions page. So if you have a moment, if you have a comment or question, please get it in there. And we'll continue tomorrow, Monday, at the regular Monday time, 6 p.m. Pacific, with Mishnah number 3 here in chapter 8. Okay, let me load up the questions and comments. Okay. Here we go. Aoife. What if the bed in the husband's home is a shared bed, not the wife's bed? Even if there is a side on which she commonly sleeps, the husband may and probably will consider the bed his. And I think that's why the bed is not a good platform to call her domain, right? The Mishnah says, no, the bed doesn't work. And they could find some exceptions where it might work, but just putting it on the bed with her, not good, right? Not good. The husband, I suppose, could say, I hereby give you this bed. It is now your bed, and here's your get, right? That might be a way to make this work. But just assuming that the get is hers when it's a shared bed, I think would not work for just the reason that you said, Aoife. Aoife also says if the man tosses the get into a basket that she does not commonly use, so she fails to find it for an extended period, is she divorced? Right, so that's a great question. I mean, there's going to be the whole thing is so weird, right? Because this event is going to be much more formal than something where it could easily be tossed aside and lost. Why? Because there's witnesses. But there have to be witnesses to the giving of the get. So the witnesses are there, and you know, because the witnesses are there, it's not like anyone is trying to pull a fast one on her. Probably the reason that they're not literally handing it to her is because she refuses to accept it. But she's gonna see that they put it in something that belongs to her because they're doing that in front of her, or at least they're doing it in a place that clearly belongs to her with witnesses, and the witnesses will make sure that she knows. So I think that the concept that she'll be divorced and not know it is actually what they're protecting her against. Joe, if a woman is nida, right, so she's having her period, the husband cannot take from or give anything to her because of her status. Correct. Correct, question mark. What a great question. What a great question. Right, so married couple cannot have any contact while, you know, she's a nida. Now that includes while she's having her period and while she counts 7 clean days after the end of the period, then immerses in the mikveh, and then returns. At that point, they can have physical contact. Can he hand her a paper where he's touching the paper and then she touches the paper, but they never touch each other? I don't know. I think that's a great question. It's a great question. They're definitely prohibited to each other during that time, but the prohibition on touching is really protection lest they cohabit, right? Having marital relations while she's a nida, that's a serious transgression. Incidental touching would render him tameh, ritually impure, and he would have to go through, he would have to immerse in the mikveh. He would have to go through a ritual purification before he could set foot in the temple when the temple is standing. But after the destruction of the temple, we sort of have all been in a state where we're all assumed to be tameh anyway. Now, we still practice family purity laws, and so, you know, husbands and wives don't make love while she's having the period and for the 7 clean days afterwards, and then she immerses in the mikveh. But in terms of handing off the get during that time, it's a great question. I'd have to think more about that and research. I just don't know the answer. Great question. If so a woman in a coma cannot be divorced because she is not conscious. Yes, that is correct. That is correct. She has to have the ability to have halakhic competence to know that she's being divorced, or the husband cannot divorce her. Is there some way that a woman who's in a permanent coma, could be divorced? Now, here is where, remember that a husband is allowed to have more than one wife. So now that was actually prohibited 1,000 years ago, so it's been illegal for the last 1,000 years. But under Torah law, a husband can have more than one wife, right? Jacob was married to Rachel and Leah. So the fact that, he's got one wife who's in a coma that he can never divorce and he has to take care of her for the rest of her life isn't going to prevent him from having another wife so that he can, fulfill his obligation to have children, for example, if he hasn't had children with the one who's in a coma. Very difficult situation. Once it became, prohibited to have more than one wife, is there going to be a way to end that marriage where she does not have halakhic competence to know that she's being given the get? I don't know. Wonderful question. I don't know the answer. Final question. If the woman's slave is awakened by the get being placed in his hand, is the divorce valid? Sounds like no. Right? The only way that the slave can acquire for her is she's standing next to the slave. The slave is asleep and tied up. And only then can you put the get in the slave's hand and it counts. That's never going to happen, right? So that's clearly where we're stretching the law to understand where it would work, but as a practical matter in the real world, that's just never going to happen, right? So we're just understanding when is a slave like a courtyard. Answer, almost never, right? Almost never. So that's what I've got for us today, and with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow.